to today's Coastal State discussion. I'm Meredith Haas from Rhode Island Sea Grant, and I will be your moderator and host for today. And for those of you that are new to the Coastal State series, welcome. This forum is dedicated to highlighting ongoing research focused on marine and coastal issues that impact Rhode Island communities. And you can find more information about the series on Rhode Island Sea Grant's website, where you can also find information about upcoming events, such as the one on December 4th, where we will be featuring researchers from the University of Rhode Island and Maine who are looking at opportunities for sea urchin farming across New England. And you can also find videos from previous discussions on our website, as well as Rhode Island Sea Grant's YouTube channel, where you'll also find today's recording. And so just to give you a brief overview of how today's discussion is going to be organized, our guest speakers today will have about an hour to present their research and their findings with us, and that will be followed by an hour Q&A. So for any questions that you have during their presentations, please just use the Q&A or chat option at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to get to everyone's questions during that Q&A segment. Or if you wish, you can raise your hand and I will unmute you, and you can ask the question yourself. And so without further delay, let's get into today's topic of multi-use experience in Rhode Island's coastal waters. With today's, with increasing activity today on, our ponds and our bay, from fishing, boating, transportation, and renewable energy development, there are bound to be many challenges, as well as potential opportunities. And so to walk us through some of this, please welcome our guest speakers for today, Dr. David Bidwell and Dr. Tiffany Smythe from the University of Rhode Island. Dr. Bidwell is a professor of marine affairs whose work focuses on social response to offshore wind development and renewable energy technology, as well as public engagement and environmental decision-making. And Dr. Smythe is an adjunct associate research professor and visiting professor of marine affairs for the academic year. Her research focuses on changing ocean and coastal uses and ocean governance arrangements. And she's also worked in ocean and coastal management as a planner, community outreach specialist, and a policy analyst. And so they will be sharing their findings today about their work, looking at how small coastal business owners experience this shared coastal space and their views on future operations within this larger context of Rhode Island's blue economy. So without further delay, I will pass that off to Dr. Smythe and Dr. Bidwell. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Meredith. So I have the task of giving a sort of a quick introduction and overview of our talk, and then I'll give things over to Tiffany Smythe, who will sort of lead us through some of the findings, and then I'll sort of come back at the end as well. So I want to give just a thank you from our whole team to Rhode Island Sea Grant for the funding and just overall support on the project and the opportunity to speak to you all and share some of the things that we've heard. As Meredith alluded to, this idea of multi-use in the ocean has become very popular in recent years. A lot of the conversation has been around sort of new large-scale infrastructure and how they can be used for multiple uses. But when this opportunity for research on multi-use came up, Tiffany and I and some other folks really were interested in thinking about how does this idea of multi-use, how is it being experienced among people in Rhode Island, and particularly among some of the smaller operators who are using the bay and the ocean near Rhode Island and that are coming from Rhode Island. And so we were able to put in a proposal for this work, and we've been working on it over the last couple of years. And this is our opportunity to share some of the things that we've learned from that research. I do want to just introduce the overall team. So my name is David Bidwell. I'm in the Department of Marine Affairs here at the University of Rhode Island. And I've really served as the principal investigator for this team and collaborating with Tiffany and some others on the project. I want to give a special acknowledgement to some graduate students from the University of Rhode Island who've been extremely helpful in our work. And that's Letty Cass, who was a Marine Affairs graduate student who graduated last year and was very instrumental in a lot of the work that you're going to hear about. And right now, a current graduate student at URI and a law student at Roger Williams, Susanna Johnson, has been working with us on some of the second phase of the project. We are also collaborating with Dr. Di Jin at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. He is an economist there. And as we get near the end of our presentation, I'll give you sort of an overview of some of the work that he's doing in conjunction with this project. With that, I just want to give you a quick overview of sort of what to expect from the presentation today. To hit to the next slide, Tiffany. So we'll, right now we're talking about an introduction, and Tiffany's going to go through and give you a little better idea of what we mean by multi-use, how this relates to the larger issue or topic of the blue economy, something that you may have heard a lot about recently, and then really introducing what our research project entails. The project has been split really into sort of two phases. And so Tiffany will review some of the findings from the round one focus groups that we held. And this is really sort of the meat of the project that we've done. Then I'll take over and explain a little bit more about what we've done since then with a second round of focus groups, some of the key takeaways from the project, some of the other components, this economic analysis as well as a legal analysis, and then just talking about some of the next steps as we wrap up our research through the rest of this year and into the beginning of next year. So with that, I will happily give the screen and the microphone over to Dr. Tiffany Smythe, who will help you understand a little bit more about our project and some of the key findings that we've had.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Looking forward to talking with you about our multi-use research and hopefully to a great discussion about where we can go next with this. I'm going to ask you to bear with me as I've been coughing a little bit today and losing my voice, and hopefully it doesn't fail me. All right, so multi-use. Let's first talk about what this concept is. So this has been defined as purposeful joint use of marine space and resources by marine users. And multi-use can range from coexistence to interactive, mutually beneficial arrangements. So let's dig in a little bit to what that actually means. So a few years ago, Maximilian Schoup and co-authors developed this really helpful typology of multi-use, a way to break down the different types of multi-use so we can understand it in a more nuanced way. And we'll talk this through starting at the bottom of the typology. So subsequent use is a complicated way of saying a simple thing, which is uses that take place in using the same place, but not at the same time. So a simple example, you are a recreational angler out there on your boat, you're fishing, you move on from that spot to another destination, and then a few minutes after you leave, a commercial fisherman comes in and uses that same spot. Okay, that's subsequent use. Moving up the typology, the next one from the bottom is coexistence. And this is a use that takes place, or a set of uses that take place in the same place and at the same time. And I'm going to see if my computer will let me go back. Oh, it will. Good. So a simple way to illustrate coexistence is the image on the left here, where you see a much larger scale commercial vessel basically in the exact same place as this recreational yacht racing vessel. That is coexistence. Okay. The third up from the bottom is a symbiotic use. So these are uses that take place in the same place at the same time, but also sharing some peripheral infrastructure or services. Now, that might not make a ton of sense until we talk about multi-purpose multi-use, which these authors at least convey as sort of the ultimate form of multi-use. This is multi-use that takes place in the same place at the same time, but also with shared services and core infrastructure. And let's talk about what that means. So looking at the figures here on the right of the slide, they are showing an offshore wind turbine and base with an aquaculture facility built right into that structure. So Two different uses, same place, same time, sharing the same infrastructure, and then sharing the same services, as in whatever vessel is coming out to service the turbine, services the aquaculture. That's sort of the idea, okay? All right, so that's multi-use. So then blue economy. I know that you've probably heard this term before. This is increasingly being used in Rhode Island, right? So the blue economy is defined differently by a variety of different scholars and policymakers and folks working in the blue economy. But generally speaking, it refers to the idea of marine-based economic development. And its current uses are increasingly acknowledging the fact that we appear to be in a new era of accelerated marine-based economic development. Okay. Now, the blue economy is often portrayed as about sustainability, that blue economy activities are sustainable, although there's, I think, questions about that. And often, but not always, the blue economy often emphasizes larger scale industrial uses of the ocean. Okay, not always, but often. So those are just some ways to think about the blue economy. Now, as you saw from the title, we have put these concepts together. And the reason we're looking at multi-use and the blue economy together is because multi-use has been described by experts and advocates as a way to facilitate the blue economy, a way to facilitate that economic development. However, it's worth pointing out that, at least with the blue economy, there has been some criticism of this concept. Some have pointed out that, well, the blue economy seems to just approach the ocean as a space for development and commodification. Some have questioned whether it's really about sustainability. Some have questioned whether it is equitable, whether it favors certain users over others. And so these are some of the reasons we were interested in looking at this. So I'm sure I don't need to say to anyone on this webinar that Rhode Island is a great place to study a topic like this. We have a rich history and tradition of diverse marine uses here in the ocean state. We are the location of the first large-scale U.S. marine spatial plan, the Ocean SAMP, which attempted to address some multi-use type issues. And then, of course, we're the location of the first U.S. offshore wind farm, so we are experiencing new large-scale offshore development right in our waters. And so we set out in the study, this is exploratory research, and this really hasn't been done to our knowledge in other areas. We wanted to explore marine users' experiences of and views of multi-use. And in particular, we wanted to focus on small operators in the blue economy. So charter operations, commercial fishermen, small aquaculture farms. And we wanted to understand, what are those users' multi-use experiences? What are they living on the water every day? We also wanted to understand their views of potential multi-use opportunities. What do they think could happen in the future that would be beneficial to their activity, to their sector? And then building on that, we wanted to see, can we come up with any innovative multi-use opportunities for the future that would involve not just the small scale operators, but also larger scale operators. Okay, so those are our big goals. And here's how we have done this. So our first phase was to conduct a series of focus groups with small operators focusing on individual sectors of the marine economy, which I'll come to in a moment. We then would use those to identify some big issue areas, some big takeaways, as well as to identify multi-use scenarios for the future. We would then take those multi-use scenarios and do three things with them. We would convene a second round of focus groups where we would integrate across the sectors, and we would integrate small and large operators. We would also have our colleague at Woods Hole, DGIN, conduct an economic impact analysis. And then we'd also have colleagues at the Roger Williams University Marine Affairs Institute have a law fellow conduct a legal analysis. David will touch briefly on the economic and the legal, which are both future projects, later in the presentation, and he'll talk about the round 2 focus groups. So our overall goal, which we haven't gotten to quite yet, is to arrive at overarching conclusions, to publish our research, and then importantly, to do outreach with the public, with policymakers, to see what we can do with this information. Okay, so now what I'd like to talk with you about is those round 1 focus groups. So as I mentioned, we conducted 6 focus groups with small operators in Rhode Island's blue economy. The sectors that we focused on were aquaculture, charters, tours, and education, commercial fishing, marine recreation, recreational boating and sailing, and recreational and charter fishing. Excuse me. In each of these sectors, each group was homogenous, meaning we pulled all the shellfish farmers together, all the marine recreation folks together. In each of those meetings, we talked with folks about what their multi-use experiences were, barriers that they anticipated to multi-use, current or future, and any opportunities that they see. Now, what I'd like to do is share with you the themes that we identified through systematic analysis of that input to share what we learned about people's experiences. So the first theme we identified is that small operators envision limited multi-use opportunities. We made a real effort in these conversations to think out of the box and get our participants to think out of the box about future opportunities. And what we found is that individuals are hesitant about multi-use, and we're not able to identify a lot of different multi-use opportunities. There were a couple of exceptions there, though. Maybe the most important one is that tourism was identified as a driver of multi-use, present and future. And that's captured in this quote that I just love. This is a commercial fisher saying, "I think it's like the best thing since sliced bread. It brings the public to the dock. I'm shoveling barrels full of bluefish, and these cruise ships come in. These women are from Georgia, and they're asking me if they can take my picture. I said, sure, don't get too close. You're going to get splattered. I think with everything the fishing industry faces, we need as much public support as possible." And so here, this fisher is saying, it works well to have tourism and commercial fishing interact in some way. Okay. Now, there were multi-use opportunities that were identified by participants. They were identified, I will say, with some hesitation in some cases, but there were a series of ones identified, and it gave us enough good ideas to move forward. David's going to talk about these a lot later in the presentation, so I won't go through all of these, but just to give you an example of one that folks actually seemed pretty excited about in a way was this first one here on this table, aquaculture, education, and tourism. And this is where we heard from marine educators, charter and tour operators, and those in similar professions that they wanted to conduct educational programs or tours at shellfish farms. And we heard shellfish farmers say that they would like to do those kinds of things too. So that was a positive multi-use opportunity that you'll hear more about later in the presentation. But let's capture more of what we heard in those conversations. The second thing we heard from participants is that most multi-use that they do experience is involuntary coexistence. So remember the typology I presented earlier, coexistence is use at the same place at the same time, okay? And importantly, coexistence was generally not framed very positively. It was framed as something that is involuntary and in some cases forced effectively. And that is meaning forced by the increase in existing uses and the incursion of new uses. In other words, folks had no choice but to be interacting with each other in very close proximity, okay? And this quote captures that idea. This is a recreational person talking about the growth of aquaculture, saying in Great Salt Pond, there's a couple of aquaculture areas that seems to be expanding over time. By Rome Point, there's extending aquaculture in that area. For the most part, we can just paddle around it, but there is a lot of concern in the community because it just seems to expand and expand, and it doesn't seem to end. So you can hear in that quote the sort of the concern about this idea and this involuntary, forced coexistence idea. Now, what's important is that there was sort of an exception to this idea that coexistence is not well tolerated. There was one form that was well tolerated by participants, and that's what we call traditional multi-use. And this means interaction between traditional users of the water, meaning, traditional users of the water as in over the past few decades, like recreational fishers interacting with sailors, that kind of idea. And so this idea is that there are some forms of traditional multi-use where individuals are operating by shared rules and norms. They've been interacting with each other for decades. And this is captured by one of our participants saying, the patterns have been there forever and ever. And so that was an interesting exception. All right, third theme. So we heard from our participants that competition and conflict characterize use interactions. So that uneasy nature of coexistence I was talking about, well, this is how participants were uneasy because of this competition and conflict. And this general idea is captured well by this charter captain saying, if you go out there on any given day, wherever the tuna fish are, there's going to be, 200 boats of all different user groups. And that person was talking about the challenge of navigating in that intense environment, right? So there's a couple of sub-themes that further illustrate this idea. The first is that a lot of this competition and conflict has been fueled in part by the increase in marine recreation over the past few years. And we heard participants talk about even before the pandemic, but also certainly during the pandemic, just increased purchases of boats, increased interest of people getting on the water. This participant said, the types of recreational use of the water has proliferated tremendously, and the different speeds and the different capabilities are wildly divergent. Plus, there's just more of them. So intense increase in this particular type of use. Okay. We also heard that this relationship between conflict and coexistence, well, it's a delicate balance. There can be that coexistence, but it's involuntary, uneasy, and it won't take much. It takes sort of a bad day, an inattentive boater looking away for a moment, and all of a sudden there is a conflictual interaction on the water, in some cases potentially a dangerous interaction on the water. And that's captured, that concern about that delicate balance between conflict and coexistence is captured by this quote here, this person saying, I've been at this yacht club for 13 years, but the last 2 years I look out and I'm like, is today the day? Now I'm like, who's going to be the idiot that really hurts somebody today or this month? Okay, so lots of concerns there. And then the third point here is that perceptions of current and anticipated conflict shape perceptions of multi-use. So there's a couple of things going on here. One is this idea that it's concern about conflict that causes maybe some hesitance about multi-use. And secondly, though, it's perceptions of anticipated conflict in many cases. So it's conflict that someone is worried about in the future as opposed to living on an everyday basis, and that those concerns are shaping views toward potential multi-use interactions. Okay. So fourth, we heard that the distinction between hard and soft uses shapes multi-use experiences. So let me explain hard and soft uses. So this is what multi-use scholars, these are the terms that they use to explain the difference between a static or a permanent fixed use of the ocean or coast, and then a soft use is a transient or mobile use. So we heard this quote will capture this very well. This is a person saying permanent uses, so those hard uses, seem to be detrimental. However, they said transient uses that don't impact or aren't there 24/7, you can always compromise with. I feel like I don't have issues with recreational boaters, sailboats, or whatever. I'll go somewhere else for 10 minutes and come back. But something that is permanent, whether it's wind farm or aquaculture related. In general, it prevents all these other multi-uses. And what's really going on here is that participants are generally, in some ways, more tolerant of those soft uses, those transient ones, but these permanent ones are what they're most concerned about. And it's that distinction that is really shaping multi-use experiences, as well as ideas of opportunities for future multi-use. Okay, fifth theme. And this was very interesting. So we heard loud and clear from our participants that coastal and water access is a barrier to multi-use. Now, folks might be used to thinking about coastal access in terms of beach access, which clearly has had a lot of press and a lot of activity in Rhode Island in recent years. And that's a very important access issue. But what we heard in these focus groups is broader than simply beach access. We heard about a lot of different forms of access affecting a lot of different types of users. And so this quote sort of captures that. This is a recreational user saying, they blocked rights of ways, including boat ramps. So not just beach access, right? And they don't want aquaculture at the same time because they don't like it in their own backyard. And so this is concern about access for a variety of different types of activities that are a form of multi-use, okay? To further elaborate on this, so I want to make it real clear that these access concerns were shared across the sectors that we interacted with. This is not just a recreational activity. This was a concern. This was shared by commercial users and educational users. So in other words, commercial fishermen, shellfish farmers, and marine educators running sort of tours and programs for children. Loud and clear on that. The second thing we heard loud and clear is that there's a variety of different factors that are limiting access. Land use change, government action or inaction, landowner behavior. But this last one is maybe most interesting, access site design. So we heard it's not simply about, that right of way and parking, which we conventionally think of as access. It's also in many cases how a particular access site is designed and whether that access site facilitates multiple different forms of use. For example, there can be a boat ramp whose purpose is to launch, small fishing or recreational craft. But if that boat ramp also had a beach nearby, and if there were also a small facility with a bathroom and changing facilities, well, then that access site would actually facilitate multiple different forms of use, so multi-use. Okay. So the last point here. So we heard from our participants that marine governance in some cases facilitates and in other cases limits multi-use. So first, how I'm using the term marine governance. Here we're referring to the actions of not just government, but also of industry and civil society, and the way all of those work together to shape activities on the water. Okay. And so we heard that those kinds of arrangements in some case actually facilitate multi-use, and participants thought that was good, but in other case limit it, maybe inadvertently. So an example of facilitating it, we heard that multi-use is facilitated by experienced users following established rules and norms. So this is really about things like the international rules of the road, navigation rules that are enforced by the Coast Guard. So users who are adhering to those rules and norms, in those cases, multi-use is actually working well, okay? We also heard other examples of multi-use being facilitated and working well by intentional voluntary cooperation and communication between user groups. And so importantly here, this is actually not an action of government. This is the private sector, industry, users getting together and saying, how can we interact out there so we can all do our thing safely and not get in each other's way? And so an example of that that was held up as a positive example is yacht clubs and regatta managers coordinating different marine events on Narragansett Bay. So one person explained this as an informal sort of a chance to avoid conflict. We'll share with each other dates when we're having regattas and events. And not only dates, but sort of like, well, are you racing south of the bridge? Are you racing up at Halfway Rock? Are you racing out the Sound? And this was explained as, this is actually how we facilitate multi-use. So we're kind of self-governing and that's working well. So that was a positive example. However, in other cases, we heard that some government programs are not facilitating multi-use. And that doesn't mean that they're intentionally blocking it. It just means that they're maybe not designed for this kind of an approach to ocean and coastal management. So this one example is very interesting. This has to do with Coast Guard marine event permits. And so this person was explaining that, yacht clubs apply for one of these permits so that the people around them know that there'll be no conflicts. That's the goal. So there will be no conflict. So the boating public will know where these events are and what type of boats they are and what the meet time is. When you have 200 6-year-olds and opties competing in the same event, it would be nice to keep them safe. he's saying, but then he goes on to say, but what we get back from the Coast Guard is a letter saying you don't need to file for this type of permit. So in other words, this person was trying to use that permitting system and the publication of that information to facilitate multi-use, but then wasn't actually wasn't actually able to do that because they were told they don't even need to go through that process. Okay. So let's kind of wrap up this first part of this. What did we learn from all of those interesting discussions? Here are the big ideas. We learned that participants identify few potential multi-use opportunities, though they do identify some, but they're generally hesitant about the idea. Tourism was an important exception in terms of existing and future multi-use opportunities and is an area to look at in more depth. Coexistence was the most common form of multi-use that our participants experienced. It was involuntary and forced. And what's so important about this, it's very interesting, is that this is what people are experiencing on the water, that this is this involuntary, forced, uneasy arrangement. Yet multi-use advocates recommend coexistence as the management goal. And so that means we have to do some work here. Okay. Third, conflicts. There's a lot of conflict on the water. We heard that loud and clear. Within the context of the multi-use research, it is not well understood. It's understood by people who are out there. It's not well understood by those who are trying to understand these issues and recommend solutions. Some forms of conflict could simply be superficial disputes. It doesn't work well to have two boats on top of each other in the same space. But other conflicts that we're seeing out there could actually be deep-rooted conflicts based on values and beliefs. And that might mean we would have to approach them differently in order to manage them. Okay. And finally, access. This was so important to folks. This was really seen as an issue limiting multi-use, yet it's not being considered by those who are working on multi-use issues, which was so interesting to us. And it is important to understand that access issues are a form of use conflict in themselves, and it might be helpful for us to think about them that way. With this, I'm going to pause and then turn things over to David, who will take us the rest of the way through the presentation. Thanks, everybody.
Forgot to unmute myself, as is the typical way in these things. Thank you, Tiffany, for covering those. I'm looking forward to people's comments and questions about those round one focus group findings. My goal now is to talk about sort of the next phase. So I think Tiffany reflected on, although people had some reluctance to think about multi-use, and in some cases it was difficult for people to imagine multi-use scenarios for the future that were attractive to them. We did, through sort of going through all of the transcripts of our focus group, we were able to identify, I believe it was a total of 14 different scenarios that people expressed some interest in or potential that this would be something that would be attractive to them. So our goal was then to try to bring together those small operators with maybe large operators, policy individuals, et cetera, who could help sort of explore some of those potential scenarios. Before we headed into those second round of focus groups, we really took some time to think about the feasibility of some of the scenarios, places where we really felt like there was an opportunity to bring people together and talk about the potential of those. And so we ended up with 4 different groups. So Tiffany, you want to go to the next slide? And here's what those groups looked like. We arrived at 4 different areas where we wanted to explore. One was a group that we called Aquaculture Plus, which is if you have these shellfish aquaculture facilities, what are other ways that other sectors can interact with those facilities in a way that is mutually beneficial or that benefits these other types of operators? We looked at this idea of expanded charters, which is we have a lot of charter operations that are working in Rhode Island, particularly around recreational fishing, as well as some tours, sort of like evening lighthouse tours or those kinds of things. what are opportunities for expanding those opportunities to get people on the water in these small, sort of individually or small company owned boats to do other kinds of activities? There was also a strong interest in research. This was something that we heard, is that there were opportunities for particularly vessel operators to be engaged in scientific research, whether that is research really coming out of academia or coming out of different new kinds of industries, such as offshore wind or technology development, and places where those vessel operators can be directly engaged in that research function. And then finally, I think Tiffany had really stressed the importance of this idea of access. And I'm sure there are a lot of people who are watching today who are familiar with the conflicts over beach use and beach recreation. But we wanted to take a different spin on it, which was thinking about if you were to think about ways that you could shape access to water in Rhode Island, the shoreline access, what are some ways that you would think about creating spaces that were actually available and functional for multi-use? So those are the 4 groups that we convened, and you can see here the number of participants. Overall, we had 43 individuals participate across these 4 groups. And you can see some of the kinds of interests that were represented within those focus groups. So again, these are sort of heterogeneous focus groups, if you want to use the term of art, where we're really mixing people together from multiple different sectors as well as different sizes of operations to see what kinds of opportunities that were there. We did hear from some people who wanted to be involved, but they didn't have the time or the opportunity. And so we also did a follow-up questionnaire where people were able to provide input that way outside of the focus group setting. Okay, can move to the next slide. So here are just some preliminary observations. So we're still in the phase of really being able to go through and really analyze the transcripts from those groups in a very careful way. But there are some preliminary observations that we can make about these groups and the things that we saw. One was that there was a real encouragement for using aquaculture farms in a different way, and that this was viewed as very important given the potential of this industry growing within Rhode Island, and that this really provided an opportunity to create greater familiarity and sort of knowledge about this industry by getting other uses to interact with those facilities. We heard from this idea of expanding charter opportunities that particularly for charter captains who are operating their own individually owned boat, they would really welcome ways of being able to expand their operations, particularly into the shoulder seasons. So for, say, like a fishing charter captain, they're really super busy during the summer, and they didn't see a lot of opportunities to expand those opportunities there. But if there were ways to expand the season in which they were making money on the water and using those boats and those vessels, they would welcome ways to think about opportunities to do that. One way that those charter captains can find other work to do and other vessel operators, like small commercial fishermen, was to engage in scientific research. And so they really saw these opportunities for research as a way of, expanding the number of days that they're able to be for hire out on the water. But there were other benefits as well, which is that people who have been engaged in research also find it as a way, as something that's really enjoyable because it adds variety to their regular operations. So it's something new and different for them to do that enables them to still be on the water and operating their vessels, but gives them sort of a little bit of variety, right? Variety is the spice of life. And then in terms of this issue around access, we had identified in round 1 this need and this desire for these sort of multi-purpose access points and facilities. But what we heard through round two is that you got to be really careful about how you do this, because there are also some potential drawbacks to creating these multi-use access points. Things like crowding, change of character for a particular shoreline access point. And so there was this desire to say, okay, let's expand some of these things, but we have to be real careful about how we do it. Okay, so those are some preliminary observations. If you could move to the next slide, Tiffany. One of the things that we heard as sort of an overarching observation among a lot of our small operators is that there was a real desire among these small operators to be reaching younger people as a way of fostering this sort of blue economy workforce. So these are people who care a lot about the sectors that they work in and about the lifestyles that they've been able to maintain, but they're very concerned about opportunities for entry of small operators and younger people into this blue economy. And this gets to some of those questions that Tiffany raised in introducing things about blue economy and multi-use is, how does blue economy and multi-use provide opportunities for these small operators instead of just larger companies and industries? And this is represented by this quote that we had from a lobsterman talking about this issue of the graying of the fleet, which is the small operators getting older overall as a population and not having younger people enter these fields. They say there are very, very few young people coming up, almost none. So in the future here, in the next 10 years or so, there's going to be a lot of guys retiring, and there's going to be a lot fewer people to do collaborative research. So it's going to be a big issue just to find people are going to be around to do the job, let alone qualified. Okay. So the next thing. So what we heard through these discussions about these sort of four different areas for multi-use were some real opportunities, such as being able to supplement fishing income with research money, right? Opportunities for companies to be able to develop that can coordinate this sort of research with vessels. So there are opportunities there, but there are also barriers, right? Which is people who are not experienced with the kinds of skills that are being asked of them, having to update equipment on their boats to be able to facilitate these kinds of research opportunities, but also difficulty in navigating some of the bureaucracy that you have to navigate to get contracts for some of these researchers, particularly from government and resource agencies, things like Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management, that there's some obstacles to being able to do that. We talked about some of the potential obstacles or warnings around multi-use with really changing the character of things that are out there, but some other barriers around facilities and how to fund those sorts of facilities for things like bathrooms, changing rooms, et cetera, parking, et cetera. For aquaculture, we heard a lot about these opportunities around educational tours and those being facilitated by a third party. So like another company that would create opportunities either for sort of recreational tours or education opportunities. And in some ways, those third parties are super important because the operators of these small shellfish farms lack the resources to be able to offer tours, or they don't have the skills or the interests or the understanding and the knowledge of how to do that. The same with expanded charters. People saw this as a really great opportunity to get more young people on the water, to build up the business during the shoulder seasons. But there are some obstacles as well. So for example, one of the places that we heard interest in expanding charters are things called like a hook and cook tourism, where maybe a charter captain is taking people out to catch fish, but then those fish are transferred to like a restaurant where the person is then able to go and actually eat the catch that they did that morning for dinner that evening. But there are some real obstacles to doing that around health restrictions and the Department of Health, as well as just the sort of marketing savvy for expanding the charters to reach different audiences and different customers who might be interested in different opportunities to get onto the water. Things like being able to watch sailing races from a charter vessel. So instead of going to the shoreline to watch the races, you're watching them from on the water. But sometimes these charter operators don't know how to reach those audiences that are out there. Next slide, Tiffany. So with that, we can answer more questions about that. I also want to give just an overview of some of the other activities that are associated with the project. And the first among those is this idea of an economic analysis. So our colleague, Di Jin at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution has been looking at some of the data that we have pulled out from these focus groups to understand these different scenarios. So as an example, we look at this idea of adding tours or other things around aquaculture facilities. And so what Jin is able to do is look at these scenarios, make some assumptions around the kind of improvements or the kinds of activities that might be there, look at existing data sources from things like our Coastal Resources Management Council or NOAA Fisheries or other areas of the literature, and then make some estimates around the kinds of gains or losses that might be seen from these new uses. So next slide. This is to give you an example of some of the other ways that aquaculture facilities, these shellfish aquaculture facilities, might be used. And so what Jen has been able to do is look at the sort of existing scenario and thinking about measures that are like dollars earned and dollars spent per acre per year, arrive at some estimates. So here in the first column, you can see this is sort of existing. Right? So aquaculture production produces a certain amount of income per acre per year, but also carries costs with it, leaving you with an overall net value per acre per year. If you were to look at some of these other kinds of uses, it of course adds in other potential income for that space, for that acre of water, of ocean or bay. So if you had a boat tour, right? That brings in a certain amount of income, but also adds some costs in. If you were to think about kayaking, just the opportunity to get people on the water recreationally and using those aquaculture facilities as a place to visit, a place to learn about things, to look at stuff, etc. A big interest that we heard was in the use of recreational fishing around aquaculture. Aquaculture facilities create structure that tends to attract fish in our area, and so they can actually be an attractive place for doing recreational fishing. And so by the time you add all of those up and you look at the costs associated with those as well, you can see there may be opportunities to greatly expand the overall net value of that acre of water for each year. And so this doesn't take into it some other kinds of potential non-monetary benefits, including reduced environmental impact of human activities by bringing things into one particular area, other kinds of types of enjoyment that are not monetary in looking at. So this is the kind of work that Jen is doing. He's taking these scenarios that we've developed and the input that we got, particularly from our second set of focus groups, to do this sort of analysis. Okay. The other kind of analysis that is going on, we have a long-standing partnership with, as does Sea Grant, with the Roger Williams University School of Law and their Marine Affairs Institute there. And they have law fellows who do research. And so we're working with them to provide some questions that they could consider in their legal analyses. The area that has become particularly interesting to them, and we know is very interesting to Rhode Island Sea Grant as well, is about these opportunities for vessels, charter fishing vessels, commercial fishing vessels, to be engaged in scientific research as a way of both facilitating research in this area and helping out some other sectors, but also expanding and diversifying the income sources for these vessel operators. So over the next year and certainly into the springtime, these law fellows will be looking at trying to understand what are some of the opportunities as well as some of the barriers in terms of regulation and legal issues around expanding those uses. So they will do that, produce a report that they'll then post to their website, as well as sharing with Rhode Island Sea Grant. Okay, next slide. So what are our next steps with this project? We've gathered all of this data, we're doing all these different analyses. Well, we're academics. So of course, one of the things that we're going to do is publish academic articles around the research that we've done. And in fact, our first article is already in review. We've submitted it to a journal to head towards publication. And we think there is at least another 1 to 2 articles that can come out of this research for that. But one thing that we're really interested in with this research, and certainly our funder, Sea Grant, is interested in, is how can the information that we learn be used to help the management of these marine spaces? And so for us, it's taking all of those conclusions and the things that we find from our research, packaging those into outreach materials in order to be able to communicate those key lessons and provide what those different opportunities are across various audiences. And this talk today is, of course, one of those ways that we do that. And so part of what we need to do is also engage with our partners and colleagues at Rhode Island Sea Grant to continue this conversation of, so what? So what does our research lead to? Are there opportunities for them to reach out to lawmakers and regulators in Rhode Island to say, here are some of the changes that might be needed in order to facilitate multi-use or to make multi-use more palatable or more successful in the state, or even places where maybe we don't want to encourage multi-use, right? Based on the things that we've heard. As well as getting out there to these other sectors and trying to figure out what opportunities there are, what might be subsequent funding opportunities through Sea Grant that could help explore some of these opportunities that we've seen overall. Okay, next slide. I can't remember, Tiffany, did you want me to go over these conclusions or do you want to jump in and go over our overall conclusions?
I'm happy to talk about them, and then you can add in if I miss anything. How's that sound?
Absolutely, that sounds great. And they've listened to me long enough for now. So.
And my voice has recovered a little bit.
Excellent.
All right, folks. So what have we concluded to date? We're not done, but we're getting close. So big conclusions. Our results suggest that small operators, do resist multi-use and don't see benefits to the blue economy, or at least to their participation in it. And that's significant because multi-use has been portrayed as the antidote to conflict that is created by increasing use of marine space through the development of the blue economy. So these are important findings because results suggest that this suggests that both multi-use and the blue economy have to be reconceptualized to address these issues. Small operators do not feel included in these blue economy activities. They're not interested in multi-use, and we might need to reconceptualize multi-use and the blue economy, therefore, to include them in that and ensure there's equity. We have found that there's also resources needed to be delivered on desired opportunities, and that dialogue across sectors can be constructive. So in other words, what we're saying here, there's some interesting opportunities that we seem to have developed during round 2 that, if enacted, could actually address some of these issues by engaging small operators more meaningfully in the blue economy. But in order to support those opportunities, there would need to be resources dedicated, whether it's further research or outreach or stakeholder facilitation. But we have found that dialogue across sectors can be very constructive, and some fascinating dialogue happened in our meetings and our focus groups that both contributed to this research and perhaps also contributed more broadly to effective management of Rhode Island's waters. And David, I know, has a good anecdote that he wants to add, which I'll let him do in 1 second. The last thing I'll say, though, is we do need more research on this subject. We need to speak with more people in more locations, and ideally we would extend this research outside of Rhode Island to learn from users in other regions and to understand more broadly some of these issues. David, did you want to
So
give that anecdote?
yeah, so the anecdote about how dialogue matters. So this was really interesting to us. So one of the issues around multi-use that was raised was this idea of recreational fishing at aquaculture farms, right? The aquaculture folks were super supportive of this to say like, hey, we like to fish there recreationally. It actually attracts fish. It's really a great place. People can come out with kayaks and do fishing or small vessels or fish from shore. But they said it's really important that you do it in the right way because it is possible to get gear and lures hung up on the equipment there at the aquaculture farm, which actually creates a dangerous situation for the workers who are reaching in, grabbing cages, working with things, and they don't want to get a hook stuck in their hands, right? What this created was then someone that was there as a representative of recreational fishing and recreational angling who said, tell me more about that because I can write a story that I share with other people in the community that says, hey, here's the right way to fish at an aquaculture farm. And so just by having those different interests together in the room, there were opportunities for creating this sort of multi-use opportunity, but also decreasing the conflict that can come around doing those things in the wrong way. So we felt pretty good about that in terms of the role of how our research helped sort of solve this or created an avenue for solving this one problem. And we think that there's a real opportunity to bring those different kinds of users together to talk about the ways that they can coexist in a more constructive way. And so with that, we'll go to our final slide, which is basically a thank you for the project. We want to acknowledge that we did have an advisory board that has helped us all along the way in thinking about the way that we're conducting this research and thinking about some of our findings. The folks who participated in our focus groups and in our other interactions, we of course couldn't do the research without their participation. And once again, just to acknowledge the award that we received from Rhode Island Sea Grant that allowed us to do this kind of research and to bring this information to you today. And so with that, look at that, Meredith. We ended at exactly an hour in, which is pretty amazing. And I know that now Meredith will facilitate a conversation for the people who are online and might have questions or comments for us to think about and respond to.
Yeah, thank you so much for this really interesting spread of research and the questions that you're asking. For those of you that are with us, if you want to either enter your questions in the chat or Q&A, or if you want to raise your hand, I can unmute you. But just to get things started, actually, I've got a few questions, obviously, but something I kept thinking of when you're talking about like perceptions, like perceive versus actual risk is what I was thinking as you're talking about people's concerns, like what they're experiencing now and then concerns for the future. I guess something that kept coming up in my mind was this aspect of carrying capacity, because that surrounds a lot of aquaculture, whether it's an environmental component or a social carrying capacity, which is kind of like our feelings of what we're tolerant of. Is that, can you apply, would that kind of methodology be applicable to this to even kind of get it? Because I guess I'm thinking also multi-use and increasing activity. Is there a limit to how much our coastal waters could even take, and how would we even quantify that? I know it's kind of a broad question, but
I can take a first dive. One is I think that's a really interesting question, this idea of carrying capacity and how many different uses can you actually have in any given space. And I think we heard some inklings around that, right? Which is, so there were suggestions of like, we need to have this listing of all of the access points and all of the different kinds of activities that could take place at them. But then people also saying like, whoa, wait a minute, let's put on the brakes because we don't necessarily want to open the floodgates to all these different uses coming to every single access point on the shore, right? So I think there really is that issue. And in part, that also gets to one of the things that Tiffany talked about in these different kinds of conflict, where you can have these sort of like day-to-day conflicts of like, I'm trying to do this and this motorboat goes by and it creates this big wake and that's sort of a problem. And so there's that level of conflict and sort of perception of conflict. But then there are perceptions that are much more difficult to overcome that relate to these sort of more basic understandings of what the ocean is and what the ocean is for. And that there may be some uses that no matter how much you are working on this sort of carrying capacity and that sort of thing, that people are just going to see them as a non-starter, right? That they're going to be against a particular kind of use based on sort of a philosophical viewpoint of what should be in the ocean and what shouldn't. And so there are some real different dynamics around that. I don't know, Tiffany, did you have something to add on that?
Yeah, first, Meredith, I think it's a really interesting question. And I want to acknowledge that I know that the CRMC's aquaculture carrying capacity policy is controversial in its own right, right? And I also believe that there have been some URI researchers who have explored the idea of sort of social carrying capacity. Unfortunately, I can't recall the specifics, but I could look it up later if needed. But what I do want to say, sort of building on David's point, is I- to the idea social carrying capacity is inherently going to be very difficult to measure because of different attitudes toward how not only how the ocean can and should be used, but tolerance of risk, like you said. And I think that was a nice point. And one way to think about it is in the Gulf of Mexico, there is a ton of hard infrastructure, of physical infrastructure close to shore and side of shore. And there's a lot of recreational activity that happens right around those structures. And it would seem to be, based on some of the studies I've read, and then also having a lot of colleagues who work down there, that there is tolerance for that. So there are regionally different sets of experiences about carrying capacity, right? There's also regionally different values and beliefs and attitudes toward how ocean space should be used. And I think if we were to compare Rhode Island and the Gulf of Mexico, we would be able to get at some of those issues.
And as you were just, in your discussions with all these different groups, especially when it comes to access, did you find that there was any, I mean, this is sharing kind of my own biases, but actually also what I've heard with just general access, this idea of out of state versus in state, who has the right to what access. And also this idea that if we develop a norm in state and if we're trying to increase tourism, how do we manage maybe folks coming from out of state where that norm is different? Was there any kind of discussion or feelings about that?
I think that I think that in-state, out-of-state did come up somewhat during our discussions. I don't believe it was dominant. Just thinking back on analyzing the round one focus groups, I don't think that was a dominant theme. Um, in fact, I think that I'm just trying to recall some of those conversations. In fact, I think that in some cases people were saying, well, access facilitates tourism and tourism is good for the state, which would imply a level of tolerance for out-of-state visitors utilizing access points, right? So yeah, I think there's some complexity in there that's interesting.
Yeah, and yet I think there is some evidence of conflict, and people didn't use that sort of in-state, out-of-state thing, but there was in our focus groups, particularly in round one, and maybe Tiffany, there's sort of a love-hate relationship with tourism, because I think people see tourism as a really strong opportunity for growing some of their sectors and growing some of their operations, right? And if you think about multi-use, a lot of the opportunities were tourism based, right? How can we get people who are coming in to spend money in our state to spend money with me on my things, right? So expanded charter opportunities, finding ways of bringing visitors out to aquaculture farms, all of those kinds of ideas. And yet at the same time, there's this acknowledgement that a rise in tourism and a rise in interest in the shoreline and coastal things that was sort of accelerated during the pandemic as people went out and looked for outdoor ways of spending their time, but has sort of maintained itself, had created some obstacles to multi-use where people would say, I used to take classrooms to a particular access point where I could get them to the water, but now you show up and that parking lot is full and there are lots of other people in that area. And so I think there was this sort of sense of, for the amount of access that the state has right now, we may have already reached carrying capacity at some of the more popular locations. And so there was some conversation about people saying, like, look, there are access points in Rhode Island that are actually underutilized. And can we think about ways of maybe spreading out some of that pain and intensity, to be able to use some access points for certain uses and allow existing uses or new uses to have a particular place where they could function.
Did you find, oh, sorry, Tiffany, did you want to add on to that?
Just one thing, I think that one of the important pieces to remind ourselves of, and David mentioned this, but I just want to foot stomp this, is that we were talking to small operators, business people in these focus groups, right? So I think if we had had citizens of the state, just sort of the general public, I think we would have had some different attitudes that might have more clearly gotten at the point you raised, Meredith. So just that.
And a really interesting question about what's being done or planned for engaging more minority entrepreneurs in the blue economy.
You want me to speak to this first, Tiffany? This is a tricky one. So one of our goals in this project was expanding our participant base beyond sort of the usual suspects that we're often interacting with. And so we made a real effort early on to try to reach out to groups that are looking for a minority and sort of historically marginalized groups in the way that they are functioning as entrepreneurs in the blue economy. And we had a really difficult time identifying sort of people to engage in that way, sort of for either our advisory board and also participants. And so there are a couple of things. Oh, that's great. I see the text, which is awesome. So we're happy to have this conversation. So one of the things that happened is, so there were a couple of things that we concluded. One may be that the methods that we were using and just who we are and our experience gave us poor entree to those groups, okay? The other is that there may be these sort of historical obstacles to entrepreneurship within those groups that has actually limited existing entrepreneurial activities from those marginalized groups that made it difficult for us to find people to interact with. So that said, I think there's a couple of things to do. One is reaching out with different kinds of research to reach those audiences that we had difficulty or didn't reach if they exist. And then the other is thinking about how these multi-use opportunities, right? So things like creating new tour opportunities, right? In the state, how we can actually attract some more diverse players, some different players from the usual suspects into that space and creating opportunities for these small operators, which I think has a lot to do with that sort of entrepreneurship that like the Rhode Island Black Business Association works with, right? And finding those opportunities to do that. So I don't know, Tiffany, did I do a good job with that response? Do you have more things to add?
That was great. And I just want to say I'm very excited to meet Christina, who just shared her information. That's fantastic. And again, I'll say too, just as a reminder, because of our effort to narrowly focus on small operators, this business lens, that did mean that we were not engaging with other members of the public who do represent historically marginalized communities. So, we have colleagues who have worked on access issues surrounding subsistence fishing, and they have done a much better job of bringing in such communities into their research. So I'm excited to figure out a way to address this because it bothered us in the study. So Christina, we look forward to connecting with you.
Yeah, that's great. And it made me think, even though this is focused on it with an economy and business bent, with the access issue, and we don't have any representation right now here from anyone from the Narragansett tribe, and kind of how they would be included with indigenous rights to these different points and whether maybe these small operators could work in that scope. So I think this is a very good point that has been raised. And I will look forward to how you guys expand and address that. One of the other questions I had was, again, within your framework, were you able to distinguish between operators who are in the salt ponds versus out in the bay versus out in Rhode Island Sound, and kind of, were they echoing kind of the same thing, or could you distinguish any differences among those?
So, David, okay, if I take a first crack at this? So it's a good question. We really didn't have enough data. We don't really have enough participants to really have done that. I'll say that. But I will say that, generally speaking, some of the issues are perhaps more relevant to coastal waters and salt ponds. But I think we heard I think a lot of the issues that we identified that are probably concentrated in that coastal margin do apply to some extent offshore as well. If we think broadly about this idea of the incursion of hard uses, creating perceived conflicts with longstanding activities, that general pattern is, in participants' views, playing out offshore in the sounds and beyond, as well as inshore around access points and aquaculture farms and so on. So I do think if we had the chance to expand this further and to do a larger scale study, looking at regional differences and maybe an inshore offshore gradient would be super interesting. But yeah, I think that's about how I would think about that. What do you think, David?
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to that. I think Tiffany is keyed in right there. Yeah.
And some of the things that you mentioned about perceived concerns, is there a way to maybe validate more officially any of the concerns, instead of just kind of, conflict? I guess, like, if there's operators who are like, here's what we're experiencing, is there or concerned about, is there any way, like a research approach that could validate any of that? Because I feel like some of the concerns that might be expressed, I'm thinking if it's going to be applied to management, they might want something more that's than anecdotes, but I don't know.
So here you get into the conundrum between qualitative and quantitative research and sort of the numbers of people that you reach. So in this kind of research, we're really trying to listen to those individual stories and experiences to understand some of the perceptions that are out there, and some of the stories that are there in terms of understanding sort of the breadth of experience. And I think that kind of data is super important and important for regulators and policymakers to listen to, because it gives you sort of a depth of understanding. Now, if you were going to institute a new policy, would you want to have sort of more numbers to back that up? You might. And so you could use this kind of research to shape maybe a more quantitative study like a survey or other ways of reaching out and getting a broader understanding of sort of what the level of experience and how much the larger population is experiencing these same things. So that's sort of my very academic kind of response around different research methodologies.
And I'll add on to that, just to be clear that these aren't anecdotal findings. These are the results of systematic qualitative research conducted through thematic analysis. We didn't beat that too heavily in this presentation because it's a public presentation, but just to be clear on that. And the other thing is, so, okay, one way to deal with that issue, because it's a great question, Meredith, is one could have a survey that we implement regionally, and we could ask people about perceptions of, or actually, we could ask them about their experiences of conflict and concerns about risk operating in certain environments with other uses. But in the end, it's still those individuals reporting their experiences and their perceptions, right? It's difficult to come up with a completely neutral, objective way of assessing whether it is appropriate for this use to be operating, in close proximity to use A to be operating in close proximity to use B, because that's about that individual's preference, right? So that's what we're talking about. And we could scale it up, but it would still be about those individuals' preferences, their tolerances, and so on.
Yeah, I just wasn't sure like if that was even possible. How would one even further investigate some of these concerns that you guys are finding? Because I guess I was thinking too, like if in the sailing world, if there's a number of boating accidents in a race, they have that kind of number to be like, oh, this race tends to have a lot of accidents, and this is just an example, but yeah, because you guys have collected so much information that I was like, oh, I don't know how you would even approach exploring one subset of concerns if you could. And I think that actually speaks to a little bit of this one question we have, whether are you collecting all of the points of conflict and the factors involved? Because one avenue would be to take, if pursuit is to see what it would take to relieve the conflicts through creating opportunity.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's a great point, which is, part of an exploratory study like this is that it can help define research priorities and action priorities for later. So, I mean, I do think, part of our hope from this study, right, is that it informs decisions made by Sea Grant for the future research that they fund. But also, I'm a big fan of Sea Grant, so let me say that opportunities of bringing people together is exactly the kind of work that Sea Grant does every day, right? And so this kind of research can help identify the types of workshops, outreach, et cetera, that could be really constructive around this idea of multi-use or even just marine conflict in general.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think, our next step, if we had one, would be maybe to choose one idea is to scale up regionally, right? But the other might be to identify one particular area of conflict and really dig into it. And to Meredith's point, it's totally true. In certain cases, there are data sets collected, by the Coast Guard on marine incidents, right? That in some cases could be useful depending on what kind of an issue we're studying. But I think what's fascinating about some of this stuff is that these are conflicts that don't necessarily rise to that sort of formal reporting level, right? Which is why some creativity would be needed in future research.
Um, and one other question I had was when you were talking about, like you said, scaling up regionally, but looking at other kind of communities, is there a community that you have in mind? Is there, I guess, like a case study elsewhere where there is multi-use that's working or has failed spectacularly and is a good example?
We haven't gotten to the point yet where we've really, laid out all our future research plans. Um, so it's a good question, right? I mean, I think that ideally, I think there's distinct regional differences. So, one way to look at it is size of water body and nature of the marine economy in a given location, right? So would we want to find a place that has, wanted to do comparative case analysis, find other locations that have similar size water bodies or similar marine economies and see if there are differences despite those similarities. The other idea would be to purposefully choose a variety of very different locations, like it would be interesting to study a subset of the Gulf of Mexico, right? Like I mentioned before, very different marine economy, very different cultural set of values that has been studied previously toward the marine environment. So something like that could be very interesting.
Yeah, and I'll say, a lot of research on multi-use is coming out of Europe. A lot of it is focused more on sort of these big industrial structures and whether you can use things like, for example, an offshore wind turbine for creating sort of a multi-use platform out in the ocean where different people can use it, et cetera, et cetera. I think one of the things that is interesting to us at least, and I hope to the others who are watching this or might read our work, is that there hasn't been a lot of work done around this idea of small operators and whether multi-use really does provide these sort of opportunities for a more just blue economy and more entree points. I think in an area where there's been a lot of consolidation of operations in the marine economy that sometimes makes it difficult for small operators or for individuals to enter these areas as entrepreneurs. So, I mean, for me, I think in part, it would be really interesting to have researchers in other areas, whether it's other parts of the United States or other parts of the world, look for examples where there has been effective and successful multi-use in particularly in terms of where it has engaged small operators and created more opportunities for entrepreneurship in those sorts of things and answering some of those critiques of blue economy that are, who does the blue economy work for? Because there's been a lot of those sorts of things. So if this work can actually spur more of that work to find those examples, I think that's a really positive outcome for us. Or, as you mentioned, right, finding where those have been disastrous, right? Because I think for us, I mean, I'm speaking for Tiffany here, but I think she would agree, is that for us, a move towards multi-use, right, as sort of a kind of a trendy thing, if the move towards multi-use actually creates more obstacles for small operators and sort of the repercussions that happen from that with like fisheries dependent communities and the kinds of communities that rely on these resources, and it actually makes it more difficult for people to get access to those industries or just access to the shoreline. That would be a real miss and a real problem in terms of the repercussions of multi-use. So, from my perspective, my hope is that, this work can help generate sort of more attention to this idea of small operators and small entrepreneurs and where multi-use provides opportunities for those users.
And if I
Sorry,
could,
Tiffany, go ahead.
that's okay. Just to add to that, one thing I don't think just to build a little bit onto what David said, I don't think we conveyed enough of this maybe in the presentation, but Of all the multi-use research that we have identified to date, the overwhelming majority is not community-based, which is what we did. We started with community perceptions. We started talking to small-scale users and wanted to build up from that. And we haven't found one study anywhere that does that. And so however multi-use research continues, I think that is so important, because this is not going to be effective as a management approach if the users who are the ones experiencing this are experiencing conflict, are not on board. So I would just encourage that, however this dialogue unfolds.
Yeah, I think that's a really useful and like valid, obviously, that's a really good point. And I was curious about how you would overlay kind of issues of climate change that might, make some of these conflicts worse or more complicated.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of this can be framed in terms of this idea of like resilient coastal communities and resilient shoreline economies, resilient blue economy. And I think there are lots of stressors, right? So, you mentioned climate change, which is sort of an ultimate stressor that sort of makes everything different. I mean, I think we see a real example, and it wasn't something that I was expecting when we started this process, but just understanding how something like a pandemic, right, has these sort of ripple effects that sort of come across everything and change the way that people are interacting, and that level of conflict that comes out from having so many new users on the water. And Tiffany talked about this idea of people sort of understanding the rules of the road and sort of norms of this sort of traditional multi-use. Well, I think one of the problems is that stressors like a pandemic, climate change, whatever it might be, create these different and new interactions by sort of, squeezing the balloon, if you will, in one area that creates more pressure in other areas.
Yeah, Meredith, I appreciate you asking about that, because I really hadn't, I mean, do climate change work, but hadn't really thought about the intersection of these issue areas. And if we just sort of start to game out some climate scenarios, right, we can see coastal erosion exacerbating the access issue, right? Uh, we can see increased demand for marine recreation in response to rising temperatures, like intolerably hot weather, right? I think there's a number of ways we could sort of game out climate stressors that show that we will see exacerbated multi-use conflicts in the future if we don't manage them. So I think that's actually a really interesting question and something for managers to be thinking about.
I wasn't sure if through any of your interviews, if anyone expressed that as a future concern, because I know with at least like you had distinguished between like shoreline, like beach access, where with sea level rise, that's going to keep moving that line in a different direction, which ultimately would affect, impact boat ramps and that kind of access as well. And actually, in all of your findings, because you presented so many interesting eye-opening findings. I mean, some of the things I felt like, okay, that makes sense. But some of them are also just kind of surprising or not as intuitive. And I'm curious from you guys on the ground doing the research, what was one of the more surprising findings for you?
Am I up now?
We both we
Yeah.
both clicked off the mute at the same
Yeah.
time. So why you go first? And don't steal my idea.
Okay, whatever it is, it won't be David's idea. Um, I mean, the access issue we mentioned during the presentation, we did not expect that to come up. I mean, I guess maybe it's not surprising that it came up, but I don't think we anticipated seeing such a nexus between the issue of access and the issue of multi-use. And David, maybe I did steal your idea.
You did, but I'll just add to it, and then I'll add another one, which is, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, for anybody who lives in the state, you've probably been exposed to this conflict over beach recreation and access. And, in the Department of Marine Affairs, where we are focused on these sort of, interactions of the marine and coastal environment and society, it's been a conversation that our faculty have worked on, that our students are interested in, all of that. And I think we didn't foresee this idea of access interacting so much with this idea of multi-use. That in some ways, if you want to expand multi-use, you have to expand access. That access was really seen as a limitation. And there are some really interesting things around that, right? Like some of the access points in Rhode Island that are managed by the Department of Environmental Protection are actually funded by grants that sort of earmark what they can be used for. And so people would be like, well, why can't we use these access points to provide some other kinds of facilities and all of that? And it's like, well, no, because it has to be designated for example, recreational fishing, right? And the state can't justify doing anything else at those areas. So that's sort of like one of those obstacles that are there that we sort of didn't see around access. Um, other surprising things. So we talked about the pandemic and how much that was a stressor. So we sort of talked about that a lot. And then I had one other thing in my mind, but now I've forgotten it. So we'll just leave it there. And if it pops back into my mind, I'll sort of wave my hands wildly and get your attention.
Well, one of
But
the things, oh,
sorry, I actually remember the other thing that I had, um, which was the fact that, and David said it, but in sort of a more generalized sense, the fact that there are some aspects of marine management that are actually limiting multi-use, and like the Coast Guard marine event permit example. And I was familiar with marine event permits from some other work that I've done. So the fact that that is actually inadvertently working at cross purposes with well-meaning users who are trying to manage multi-use, that actually was pretty interesting. And if I had all the time in the world, I would dig into that further.
I remember what else it was that I wanted to say, Meredith. So I'm sorry. I'm going to go ahead and take this. I think one of the things that was interesting for me was in the way that we shaped this study, we thought, oh, people are going to come into these first round focus groups and have all these ideas about things that they want, right? Like, oh, if we had this infrastructure, we could do that. Or, boy, we'd really like to work with the offshore wind industry, let's say, for example. And I think it was surprising to me the lack of interest in multi-use from some of our participants. That you would ask them like, what are some ideas that you have? And they were just like, yeah, no. In reality, we'd just be much happier if we were just left alone. Um, but but we don't get that choice, right? And so I think that was fairly interesting for me. And then I'll add one more because why not? Is that when we had that list of scenarios that we did come out with, and we started to try to figure out, okay, is this something that we could feasibly investigate? There were sort of larger obstacles to some things than I think we imagined, where the answer that we got from people who really, would know was like, yeah, it's not even worth having that conversation because until X regulation changes or until Y industry is more accepting of these sort of working with other interests, there's not really a conversation to be had. And I think that was particularly interesting. So, um, those things were pretty interesting to us.
and it made me think of your point. I don't know if your slide on the economic part, and I know this was your other cohort who was
Yeah.
looking at the economic analysis. But when you'd mentioned kind of this concern about the graying of the fleet and opportunities for this next generation workforce, I guess I'm curious that how much of the economy does the small operator portion contribute to? And if it's kind of phasing out without these opportunities to kind of keep going and develop into the future, then to your point, I guess, about like why focusing on small operators is so important. But if they don't have, if they're not, I guess, having the resources to invest in their future longevity, what does that mean for the future um, economic component for our state? Is that like, I don't know if that was already on your slide or if your Woods Hole cohort is looking into that.
So
He's not here to answer that,
you've sort of
but
tapped into sort of a big philosophical question, right? In some ways, and we'd have to check back with Dijen and see sort of what he thinks about that. I mean, obviously, there's data that there is money to be made in the ones that are being sustained. I mean, I think that certainly is there. I think sort of the interesting question is what are the obstacles to younger people or to new populations getting engaged in this work, right? What are the obstacles to that? And I think that would require more a different kind of study. And I'm almost certain there must be people who are actually doing that work, and looking at what some of those obstacles are to this sort of, blue entrepreneurship. If they're not, that would be a great place for Sea Grant to provide funding for ongoing research that might actually honestly attract some different kinds of researchers than people like, me and Tiffany, although, I love doing the research and I love getting the funding from Sea Grant, but there may be other folks who could step in and answer some of those questions about what are the obstacles to that sort of blue entrepreneurship.
Yeah, I think this is such an interesting question, actually. And I have two sort of unrelated thoughts. One, when I was looking at Jin's slides, we haven't, he's still working on that analysis, and we only got that preliminary slide a couple days ago. When I saw the dollar value, of increased value of that acreage, I was thinking, okay, but who gets that money, right? So that's one piece of this that I think is a really important question, because that might look appealing, but what will matter to coastal communities, to small operators, is that all going to some larger corporation? Is it going to our small businesses here on the coast, right? So that's not exactly what you were asking, but sort of related. The other thing, in terms of entree to these professions, these activities, one thing that was emphasized is the complexity of trainings and certifications and licensing and requirements, and contracting. That, for example, is what is a challenge for commercial fishermen trying to do research. And so I think that there is such opportunity for, I mean, these are value decisions in the end, right? In terms of wanting to support these industries and wanting to ensure diverse participation in them. But there is such opportunity to support workforce development in all of those ways, whether it's by directly providing a training or providing access to that information or whatever it is. And I hope to see more of that kind of thing grow over the years as Rhode Island and our region's blue economy initiatives expand.
yeah, what I think I love about this research so much is that you guys have so clearly identified barriers. And I think it just seems like such a like essential place to start to address, whether, like to your point, multi-use is the path forward or not. And I think just identifying what these problems are, like real problems, not just perceived problems or maybe academic, theoretical problems. And I appreciate the work, and I'll definitely pass on to my higher ups in Sea Grant funding wishes and potential avenues for research.
Well, and I do want to add too that, one of the things, so we had to make decisions about what ideas we were going to pursue in our second set of focus groups. And I've talked about some of that. And I'll go ahead and just give an example of one of the areas is this whole idea of hook it, cook it types of things where, and more shoreline opportunities for direct sales of seafood, which there are some examples of success in Rhode Island. I've heard in terms of like lobster sales in Newport, people can go down to the dock, they can buy their lobster right there, etc. There are some significant obstacles that are sort of state specific around how like the department, this is what we've heard from people around like how the Department of Public Health handles these questions and the level of stringency that they have on some of these health guidelines really would make it difficult, if not impossible, to do some of those kinds of programs. Where we chose not to focus our attention there, right? Because changing that is probably going to require pressure from much higher up sort of political powers at the level of the government or the governor, the legislature, et cetera, in terms of setting these priorities for the state in terms of areas that they want to pursue, to be able to say like, hey, maybe we need to change the way that we do things or create new or different regulations for different kinds of uses. We still want to communicate those ideas. So we didn't take all those other ideas that were offered and just scrap them, right? We want to make sure that we present those to Sea Grant in our outreach materials, et cetera, to say like, hey, here are some ideas that were offered where we just weren't quite sure how to get traction on this. Another one is, so there's a big example that's often given of multi-use where you're combining like offshore wind and aquaculture. So one, we didn't hear a great deal of interest in that from our small operators in combining aquaculture and offshore wind. But where we did hear interest was if people know anything about offshore wind turbines and the foundations that are below water, is they very quickly become fouled with marine life. So in particular, mussels. Okay. And there was an interest from our small operators in, hey, wouldn't it be cool to be able to go out to these turbines and actually collect mussels off of those turbines? But sort of given where the industry is now in thinking about risk and just getting it up, we were advised, hey, the US offshore wind industry probably isn't there in terms of having that conversation at this point, right? So there are these ideas that are out there that may require maybe a little more creative thinking on the part of some of the more powerful interests, government, industries, corporate entities, to sort of think more creatively about how they could work with smaller operators to provide these opportunities. So, in part, our research can help to sort of, I hope, maybe expand some of those ideas, or what are some ideas that maybe require a little more muscle in terms of pursuing them. No pun intended, actually. I realized I did that, so.
Could I add something? So one of the things, and this actually comes back, Meredith, earlier to you asking what surprised us, and I think it's another sort of aspect of this research, maybe that Sea Grant could advance regardless of research funding. But to David's point earlier, we did find that people had a hard time envisioning the future. They had a hard time coming up with sort of multi-use opportunities or ideas. What made me think of this, Meredith, is when you said, we did a good job of identifying barriers. And interestingly, barriers were not initially what we were interested in, but they're what people wanted to talk about. And they were totally legitimate and appropriate thing to talk about. So we learned a lot about them. But I feel like solving some of these problems moving ahead really does require sort of future-oriented thinking that many of us, self included, are not good at. It requires imagination and suspension of belief and of your current sort of biases. And so it would be, I hope that we see Sea Grant moving forward, continuing to do really important outreach with coastal communities on these issues, because the only way we're going to move through these conflicts is by enabling folks to be able to envision the solutions that they want, right? Rather than have them foisted on them from someone else. So, yes.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point because it goes back to like tolerance of risk. And part of that is just kind of like what's known, what are the unknowns. And, to all the points that you made about kind of what people are concerned about, what they might be open to. And like to your point about kind of where some ideas need more creativity or muscle, I guess I was thinking about like short term, maybe some of this can be kind of blocked off between short term and long term goals or needs. I don't know. I just find your findings very fascinating. And it's like, again, to the point of the barriers, because I just think when you identify what the problem is, then that's where like the real creativity can kind of happen moving forward. And so it's just
And
exciting
you could,
what you guys have done.
yeah, I mean, you could certainly imagine, something with, if provided funding by Congress to do such things. So that's my bid, like talk to your congressional representatives about maintaining and expanding the funding for Sea Grant. Um, that you can see an organization like Sea Grant or even something like Rhode Island Commerce, right? Like offering up sort of small grants for people who are interested in investigating these entrepreneurial opportunities to be able to bring those groups together and continue the conversations, maybe write up business plans, seek small business loans, et cetera, to be able to pursue some of these issues. And I'll just say, because it was one of those areas that I think was sort of discussed the most, was this idea of like third-party tour operators being able to work with shellfish folks, right? Well, that's going to require like access to a boat. It's going to require training of people. It's going to require coordination. It's going to require marketing. All of those things require money and a plan, right? And so part of the question is, and I maybe if she's still on the call, right, like the Black Business Association, right, those sorts of things can create these sorts of programs where they provide just small amounts of resources for people to start being able to pursue these sorts of ideas, okay, and come together and look for, you know, how much opportunity is really there. Because I will say that one of the things that we heard from small operators as an obstacle was exactly this idea of risk, right? Like how much do we invest in a new business opportunity that's going to require us to maybe hire people, buy new equipment, et cetera, if we don't know whether it's actually going to fly, right? And so, I think that sort of risk aversion is really natural. And one of the places where these sorts of government or quasi-government industry sorts of programs can do is helping to reduce that risk for entrepreneurs to be able to investigate opportunities and whether they can actually make things work, right? So, now I'm talking really from things that aren't my area of expertise, but I'm happy to talk about them anyway. So
Well, and the idea that David was just talking about, right? Like, so theoretically, Sea Grant or Rhode Island Commerce funding, these ideas so that these small businesses could grow them. There's another value to that that goes back to the anecdote that David talked about in our meeting. All of a sudden, us finding us, we were engaged in some sort of like a consensus building exercise between shellfish farmers and recreational fishers, which, knowing how things have been challenging with those two uses in Rhode Island for a while, was remarkable. And so I think that there's a value in investing in positive multi-use opportunities that is beyond the simple business value and the jobs created by that, right? Because positive interactions between shellfish farmers and tourists and other Rhode Islanders could go a long way toward mitigating conflict that has existed now for years in that space, right? So that addresses other sort of pressing management issues. So I can see a lot of good reasons for us as we formulate our more outreach oriented conclusions and recommendations to say, there's benefits to taking some of these ideas and investing in them, not just for job creation, not just for more equitable access, but even for conflict resolution more broadly.
Thank you so much. I think that's all the questions that I have. If anyone else wants to add any other questions, or if you think of anything later, you can certainly email me or our speakers today, and we'll follow up with you as best as we can. But if there are no more questions, I really want to thank Dr. Smythe and Dr. Bidwell for taking the time to put together this presentation and sharing with us your research and findings, and for a very interesting discussion. And like I said before, I will certainly pass on thoughts on future research to Sea Grant and our partners, and hopefully we can kind of keep this thing going. Do you guys have any other final thoughts or?
I just wanted to say thank you to the folks who are online who sort of stuck it out and engaged through this whole conversation. It's really great to be able to get our work out to people to hear what we've been doing. So thank you, and thank you again to you, Meredith, for providing the opportunity.
Great. Well, thank you again. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Tiffany, I cut off again.
Yes, thank you, everybody. And I want to say there were some really interesting comments here in the chat from folks, and I appreciate those individuals sharing their ideas and contact information and hoping that we'll find a way to continue the conversation. Thank you. Meredith, thank you for your great questions and discussion. This has been fun.
And just a reminder for folks that we did record today's discussion, and it will be uploaded on Rhode Island Sea Grant's website as well as our YouTube channel. And everyone will get an email notification of when that is up and ready, including you guys as well. So again, thank you and take care.